The frost came early to Salvation Creek in the autumn of 1887. It came the way all hard things come to Montana without warning and without apology, descending from the high peaks in the night and settling over the valley like a judgment. By morning, the grass along the creek banks had gone stiff and white, and the mud in the main street had hardened into ridges that preserved the tracks of horses and boots like impressions in cooling iron. The aspens on the lower slopes had already surrendered their yellow, and what leaves remained clung to their branches with the desperate grip of things that knew the wind was coming for them. Maren Elwyn had been awake since before the frost. She was 17 years old, and she had learned to sleep lightly in the 2 years since her father died. Not from fear exactly, from habit. From the understanding acquired slowly and without ceremony that the world did not pause to let you rest, and that the morning always brought new arithmetic that needed solving before the day could proceed. So she rose in the dark and built up the small fire in the iron stove and stood at the window of the cabin they would soon be required to vacate, watching the frost claim the yard inch by inch. And she held her father's journal against her chest the way another girl her age might have held a prayer book. Kai Elwyn had been a miner, not in the romantic sense that men in towns sometimes spoke of miners with their talk of fortune and discovery and the heroic extraction of wealth from the resistant earth. Kay had been a miner in the true and technical sense, which is to say, he had understood rock the way a doctor understood the body as a system of pressures, in histories, and invisible forces that express themselves in visible symptoms if you knew how to look. He had grown up in the coal seams of South Wales, where the knowledge of how the earth moved and breathed and compressed itself was not an academic subject, but a survival skill passed from father to son in the lamplight of tunnels where the ceiling was close and the consequences of ignorance were absolute. He had come to Montana in 1879 with his young Polish wife Sina, two travel trunks, and a mind full of geological observations that nobody in the territory had yet learned to value. He had worked the copper mines east of Salvation Creek for 6 years, earning respect, if not wealth, until the morning in September of 1885, when a section of the number 3 shaft gave way without warning and took him and two other men into the dark. Maren had been 15 years old when they carried her father's body out of the mountain. She had stood at the mouth of the shaft and watched, and she had not cried because crying was not the language she had for what she felt. What she felt was too large and too precise for tears. She felt the specific weight of understanding settling into her bones that the person who had taught her how to think about the world was gone, and that she was now in possession of all the tools he had given her and responsible for finding out what they were worth. She kept his journal. It was a small thing bound in worn brown leather, its pages dense with his precise, angular handwriting, and interspersed with drawings of geological formations and ventilation diagrams, and the kind of technical observations that a man makes when he is in love with a subject and has no audience for it except the page. She had read it so many times in the 2 years since his death that she could recite passages from memory. She read it the way other people read letters from someone they miss, for the sound of the voice behind the words, for the particular quality of attention that the writing preserved. Behind her in the small bedroom, she could hear her mother's breathing. Senna Elwyn was 41 years old and she sounded 60. The cough had taken root in her lungs sometime in the second winter after Kai's death, when the money had run thin and the cabin had grown cold in ways that a single fire could not entirely address. It was a dry, rattling sound, familiar now, the constant low percussion of their days. On bad mornings it shook her entire frame. On good mornings it was merely present, the way a bad road is merely present, a fact of the journey rather than a crisis. This morning Maren noted was somewhere in between. She poured water from the pitcher into the small pot and set it to heat on the stove. She cut 2 slices from the heel of a loaf of bread that was 2 days old and laid them on the iron surface of the stovetop to warm. She did these things with the efficiency of someone for whom the morning routine had long since become a form of quiet discipline, each action in its proper sequence, nothing wasted, nothing omitted. The journal lay on the table beside her as she worked. She had opened it that morning to a page she knew well, a diagram, near the middle of the book, drawn in her father's meticulous hand, showing a horizontal passage dug into a hillside with a long trench running beneath its floor and a simple chimney stack rising from the far end. Beside the diagram and the careful notation of a man who wrote for himself rather than for an audience, he had noted, "The mountain breathes." In summer, the cool, dense air inside flows outward, a gift to the hot day. In winter, the warmer, lighter air tries to rise, but a long, gentle slope can hold it. The stone is a miser. It holds on to every degree of warmth. A fire at the mouth is waste. A fire deep inside with a long chimney teaches the smoke a lesson in generosity. She had read those words perhaps 100 times. She understood them differently each time, the way understanding deepens with experience, the way a truth that seems simple reveals its complexity only when you have lived enough to need it. Today, for the first time, she was reading them with a specific purpose in mind. The sound of her mother's cough from the bedroom was not just the sound of illness. It was the sound of the particular morning that had arrived, the particular circumstance that made everything her father had ever taught her either useful or useless, depending on what she chose to do with it. Today was the day of the council meeting. Senna emerged from the bedroom as Marin was lifting the heated water from the stove. She moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned to budget her physical effort, each action deliberate, nothing expended without purpose. She was a small woman, fine-boned, with the kind of face that had probably been beautiful when she was young, and was now something more interesting than beautiful, weathered and precise, with dark eyes that observed everything and disclosed very little. She sat at the table and wrapped both hands around the cup Marin offered her, and she looked at her daughter across the surface of the steam with the expression of a woman who had already assessed the day and arrived at conclusions she had not yet chosen to share. They did not speak about the meeting. There was nothing useful to say about it that had not already been said. They had known for 3 weeks that the Salvation Creek Town Council intended to reclaim the cabin on charterland, and they had spent those 3 weeks in the private arithmetic of their situation, each of them calculating independently and arriving at the same answer, which was that they had no good options and needed to identify the least bad one before the worst one was made for them. Marin ate her bread standing up the way she usually did, because sitting down in the mornings felt like a luxury she had not earned yet. She watched her mother drink the hot water slowly in small, careful sips, and she thought about what came next. The walk to the town hall took 20 minutes through streets that were already busy with the early commerce of a mining town in the last weeks before heavy snow. Men with pack animals and men without carters and smiths, and the women who ran the boarding houses and the laundries that kept the functional economy of Salvation Creek operating, while the men extracted the copper that funded its aspirations. The town had been here for 9 years, and it looked at a collection of wood frame buildings in various states of finish, some ambitious and some merely functional, arranged along 3 streets that had been laid out with optimism, if not precision. Marin walked with her mother, and she noted, as she always noted, the particular quality of attention that followed them in a place like this. Not hostile attention, not usually. Something more complicated. The town of Salvation Creek had a specific relationship with people like Senna Elwyn, people who had come from elsewhere, who spoke English with the accent of a different country, whose poverty was visible, and whose circumstances were understood to be a social problem requiring management. The attention was the attention of a community monitoring one of its margins, checking to ensure that the margin was holding. Marin had spent most of her life being the margin. She had stopped flinching at the attention some years ago. The town hall was a single large room that smelled of pine resin and old tobacco and the specific mustiness of civic importance. 5 men sat behind a long table at the far end. Alderman Crow occupied the center position, which was where he always occupied, because Crow understood the language of spatial authority and used it fluently. He was a compact man in his early 50s with a rancher's hands and a banker's eyes, the eyes of someone for whom other people were primarily variables in an equation rather than persons in themselves. He wore a good coat and a clean collar, and the expression of a man conducting a reasonable transaction that happened to involve the lives of other people. Marin and Senna stood before the table. There were no chairs offered. Marin had not expected there to be. Crow cleared his throat and opened the folder before him. He spoke in the measured tone of a man who had delivered unwelcome news often enough to have developed a procedure for it, a rhetoric of regret that left no room for argument because it left no room for anything except acceptance. The board had reviewed their situation. The cabin on charterland was needed for the new assayer who would be arriving from Butte before winter. The timing was unfortunate, but the necessity was clear. The board was not without compassion. Here Crow paused as if to allow the compassion to be appreciated, and therefore had arranged to deed them a plot of land in recognition of Kai Elwyn's years of service to the town's mining interests. He produced a document from the folder and placed it on the table between them. 3 acres at Coldwater Bluff, free and clear, deeded to them outright, no conditions. He said it with the air of a man presenting a gift that should inspire gratitude. Marin looked at the document. She had heard of Coldwater Bluff. Everyone in Salvation Creek had heard of Coldwater Bluff, in the way that a community hears of its most useless places as a reference point for futility, the place you gestured toward when you wanted to indicate worthlessness. A steep north-facing slope of loose shale and wind-twisted juniper at the eastern edge of the territory boundary, notable only for a shallow cave in the hillside that the town's children called the Bear's Throat and gave a wide berth. No timber for building, no pasture for grazing, no water except the snowmelt that ran off it in destructive torrents each spring and was gone by June. A grave with a deed attached. Marin looked at the document for a long moment without touching it. Then she looked at Crow, who was watching her with the careful neutrality of a man waiting to see if there would be a scene, prepared to handle one, if there was, but hoping to avoid the inconvenience. "We thank you," Marin said. Her voice was clear and level. She reached out and took the document from the table, her calloused fingers closing around it with the deliberate steadiness of someone taking hold of a thing they intend to use. She did not look at Crow's face when she did it. She looked at the document, at the small square of useless land drawn on the survey map attached to it, and she looked at it the way her father had always told her to look at problems. Not as they are, as what they might become. Beside her, Senna stood perfectly still. They walked out of the town hall into the cold morning. The sun was at the angle that turned the main street of Salvation Creek into a study in long shadows and hard light, the false front buildings casting their darkness across the mud that had hardened overnight into the shapes of hooves and boot heels. They did not speak until they had walked far enough from the town hall that the particular quality of silence around them changed from the silence of other people listening to the silence of genuine privacy. Then Senna stopped walking. She reached into the interior pocket of her coat, the deep pocket sewn inside the lining that Marin had not known existed, and she took out a folded piece of paper. The paper was old, folded and refolded many times, the creases soft with age and handling. She held it out to Marin without preamble. Marin looked at it, then she looked at her mother. 3 years ago, Senna said. Her English still carried the particular melody of Polish, the way certain words lengthened at the wrong place, the way emphasis fell differently than native speakers expected. When Kai was still working the number 3 shaft, he left the journal on the table one night when I was cleaning. I read some pages. She paused. I did not understand the drawings, but I understood that they were important. I understood that he had thought about them for a long time. She gestured toward the paper. I copied the pages that had the most drawings, the ones he had gone over the most times with his pencil, where you could see he had been working on something he was not finished thinking about yet. Marin unfolded the paper. It was 6 pages from her father's journal, copied in Senna's careful hand, the letters precise, if not technically fluent, the drawings reproduced with the earnest accuracy of someone who did not understand what they were copying, but understood that the exact shapes mattered. The diagrams of the underground flue, the calculations of draw and thermal gradient, the notes about stone as a thermal battery, about the relationship between fire depth and heat efficiency, about the physics of smoke, and the proper design of a firebox for underground application. The pages her father had spent the most time on. The pages that constituted, in essence, the heart of everything he had figured out over 20 years of thinking about how heat moved through rock. I kept them in my shoe, Senna said. For 2 years. I did not know what they were for. I knew they were his. I knew they mattered. She looked at her daughter steadily. Your father put his knowledge into words. I kept the words alive. The rest is yours. Marin stood on the main street of Salvation Creek with her father's copied drawings in her hand and her mother's dark eyes on her face, and she felt the full weight of what was being transferred, not just paper, not just ink, but the accumulated intelligence of a man who had spent his life underground, learning things that no one around him had thought to value, until now passed first to the woman who had loved him, and then to the daughter who had inherited his way of seeing. She folded the pages carefully and put them in her pocket. That afternoon, while Senna rested, Marin walked to Coldwater Bluff. The path climbed steadily away from the town, leaving the cluster of cabins and corrals behind and entering the particular desolation of the upper country where the tree line thinned and the rock began to assert itself through the soil with the patient insistence of something that had been there longer than everything above it and would be there long after. The air was colder up here, and the wind had a different quality, not the channeled wind of the valley that moved in predictable directions, but the open country wind that came from everywhere and had no manners. She arrived at Coldwater Bluff in the middle of the afternoon. It was worse than she remembered, which was saying something because her memory of it had not been generous. The ground was a carpet of sharp, loose shale that shifted under her boots with every step. The individual pieces angled and irregular in the way of rock that had fractured along fault lines rather than worn smooth by water. The slope faced north at an angle that meant it received almost no direct sunlight, even in summer and none at all in winter. The wind was constant and directional here, funneled by the configuration of the surrounding hills into something that behaved less like weather and more like a slow, continuous pressure applied to everything exposed to it. The junipers along the slope were stunted and twisted into the shapes of things that had spent their entire lives trying to grow in one direction and been defeated by the wind into growing in another. They were not trees so much as arguments, evidence of a long negotiation between organic ambition and geological fact, a negotiation that the rock had mostly won. Marin stood at the base of the slope and surveyed it without emotion the way her father had taught her to survey a formation before making any judgment about it. You looked first with your eyes and tried not to think. You let the information come in before you started organizing it into meaning. The shale, the angle, the wind direction, the absence of useful timber, the absence of standing water, the north exposure, the steepness. One by one, she cataloged the facts of the place, the way a doctor catalogs symptoms, not yet diagnosing, simply noting. Then she turned her attention to the bear's throat. It was set into the face of a rock outcrop near the upper edge of the slope, a fissure in the exposed Precambrian granite, dark against the pale gray of the surrounding stone. Someone had thrown stones at the entrance over the years because children did that, and thorny wild rose had colonized the approach so that getting to the opening required navigating through its aggressive scratching attention. Marin went through it without hurry, the thorns taking their toll on her sleeves, and she stood at the entrance to the cave and looked in. The opening was perhaps 10 feet wide and 7 feet high at its tallest point, and it ran back into the hillside for 30 feet before narrowing into a crack too tight to follow. The floor was uneven, a combination of compacted soil and fallen rock, not treacherous exactly, but requiring attention. The smell was the smell of enclosed stone, damp and mineral and old, the smell of a place that had been sealed from the regular circulation of weather for so long that it had developed its own atmospheric vocabulary. The light from the entrance fell away quickly as she moved inward. Within 15 feet, it was dim enough that the details of the rear wall were uncertain. Within 20 feet, it was genuinely dark. Anyone else, any other 17-year-old girl handed a deed to this place and sent to inspect it, would have stood at the entrance for a few minutes, registered the darkness and the cold and the smell, and left with their worst fears confirmed. Marin went inside. She went in and she stood in the dark, and she did what her father had taught her to do when she was underground and wanted to understand a space. She closed her eyes because with the eyes closed, the other information came forward. She stopped looking and started listening, stopped processing visual data, and started feeling the quality of the air, the temperature gradient between the entrance and the interior, the particular stillness of the space, the way sound moved or did not move within it. Her father's voice was clear in her memory with a particular Welsh cadence that she had loved and missed every day since September of 1885. The surface is a liar era. It screams with the heat and the cold. But go down just a few feet. Go down. And the earth tells the same story all year long. A story of constancy. That is what the deep places know. The mountain does not experience seasons the way the surface does. The mountain experiences time differently. The air in the cave was cold. Of course it was cold, but it was cold in a specific way that Marin recognized from years of accompanying her father into mine shafts. It was uniformly cold, not variable cold. It was the cold of a space that had reached an equilibrium with its surroundings and held it. It did not have the bitter, searching quality of outside cold, The cold that came looking for you and found every gap in your defenses. It was still cold, held cold. The cold of something that had been the same temperature for months. She held up her hand and turned it slowly, feeling for air movement. There was almost none. The fissure at the back was too narrow to create any significant circulation. The entrance was the only real opening, and the orientation of the cave running horizontally into the hillside meant that even there the wind that was so merciless on the outside slope barely penetrated more than a few feet. The rock walls were 14, 16 inches thick in places where she ran her hands along them. Solid Precambrian granite, the oldest and densest rock type in the territory. Not layered, not fissured beyond the initial crack that had formed the cave. Monolithic. Marin stood in the cold dark of the bear's throat and began to think. The problem was not the cold exactly. The problem was the rock. A fire built inside this cave would heat the air. Yes, but the air was a tiny fraction of the thermal mass of the surrounding stone. Every calorie of heat put into the air would immediately begin migrating outward into the rock, driven by the fundamental physics of conduction. Heat always moves from warmer to colder, always without exception until equilibrium is reached. The rock was a vast reservoir of cold. Warm it and it would eventually become warm, but the amount of heat required to warm it and the time required was enormous. This was the problem her father had written about. The stone is a miser. It takes a long time to fill its pockets, but a miser, once his pockets were full, was reluctant to spend. She came back out of the cave into the thin October sunlight and sat on a rock and took out the journal and the copied pages from her mother, and she read them again, not quickly and not casually, but with the deliberate attention of someone solving a problem that required every available tool. The diagram of the underground flue. 40 feet of horizontal passage sealed and lined with flat stone running from a firebox inside the cave outward to a simple chimney stack at a distance. The hot gases from the fire, instead of rising immediately and escaping through a conventional chimney, were forced to travel the full 40 feet horizontally through this sealed stone channel before they could exit. Forced to travel in direct contact with the stone of the channel. Forced to give up their heat not to the air, not to the sky, but to the stone itself, which absorbed it and conducted it upward into the floor of the cave. The floor would become a radiant surface, not hot, not the scorching, immediate heat of a fireplace, something more fundamental and more persistent. The gentle, even radiation of a surface that had absorbed heat slowly and would release it slowly, hours of warmth from a fire that was no longer burning the thermal debt of the stone being paid back in small, continuous installments. The smoke, by the time it reached the chimney stack 40 feet away, would have surrendered most of its thermal energy to the stone. It would emerge not as the black heat-wasting plume of a conventional fire, but as something thin and pale, nearly invisible in cold air, a wisp of carbon and steam that had already paid its way. I am making the smoke pay rent for its passage. She had heard her father say it once in the kitchen of their cabin when he was explaining his idea to a skeptical colleague from the mine office. The colleague had laughed. Too complicated, too theoretical. Not the way things were done. The way things were done in Salvation Creek in the winter of 1885 involved large open fireplaces that consumed enormous quantities of wood and heated primarily the air directly above the flames in the space 2 feet in front of them, while everything else in the room remained cold. The way things were done had been doing the same thing for as long as anyone could remember, and it worked well enough that nobody thought to ask whether it could work better. Kai Elwyn had asked. The mine office had declined his proposal for a redesigned heating system in the lower shafts. 3 months later, working in those same cold shafts, he had died. Marin folded the journal and the copied pages and put them back in her pocket. She stood up and looked at the bear's throat, and she looked at the slope around it, and she looked at the shale that would need to be cleared and the clay deposits in the bank nearby that would serve as mortar. And she looked at the configuration of the land with the new eyes of someone who had just finished making a decision. The grave they had been given was going to become something else. She began walking back toward town, calculating as she walked. She needed flat stones for lining the flue. There were plenty of those in the shale field to the west. She needed clay for sealing the joints between the stones. The exposed bank she had noted on the way up would do. She needed wood for the front wall and the door frame salvaged lumber, whatever she could find. She needed her father's tools, which she still had: his pickaxe, his short-handled miner's shovel, his collection of chisels and wedges. She needed to dig. That night, while Senna slept, Marin sat at the table in the cabin with both sets of documents spread before her and a candle burning at her elbow. She worked with her father's pencil, extending his original diagram, adding the specific measurements of the bear's throat, calculating the volume of the flue she would need to excavate, estimating the amount of flat stone required to line it. The calculations were not complex. Her father had done most of the hard thinking, but they required precision, and she worked through them twice to confirm the numbers. When she was done, she blew out the candle and sat in the dark for a few minutes. There was a possibility she had not examined yet, because examining it required a kind of emotional accounting she had been postponing. The possibility that this would not work. That Silas Drummond was right, that the ground would steal the heat, that the smoke would not draw properly through a horizontal passage, that the whole system would prove to be exactly what everyone in Salvation Creek believed it to be: the desperate improvisation of a girl who had read too many books and not enough reality. She sat with this possibility for a while. Then she thought about the diagram in the journal and the logic behind it, and she thought about the 20 years of underground experience that had produced that logic. And she thought about the specific quality of cold she had felt in the bear's throat. That afternoon uniform held the cold of equilibrium rather than the cold of exposure. And she decided that the physics did not care about what Silas Drummond believed. The physics would do what the physics did. Her job was to apply it correctly. She went to bed. In the morning she began. The first day of excavation was the worst day, and the worst day established the standard for everything that followed, which was the standard of work that did not accommodate despair. The ground at Coldwater Bluff was not simply hard, it was specifically deliberately hard in the way of terrain that had been compressed by geological time into a combination of compacted soil and shattered rock that presented a unified resistance to the pickaxe. Each swing produced a small victory. The accumulation of small victories over the course of a full day produced a trench that was perhaps 4 feet long and 18 inches deep. Marin looked at the trench at the end of that first day, her arms aching from the shoulder to the wrist, and she made a simple calculation. At this rate, working alone, she needed approximately 10 more days to complete the excavation. They had perhaps 5 weeks before the first heavy snows would make working outdoors impossible and make the path to Coldwater Bluff impassable for long stretches at a time. The arithmetic was uncomfortable, but not impossible. She went home, and she ate, and she slept, and she rose in the dark and went back. On the third day, as she was setting the first capstones on the section of flue she had already excavated and lined, she heard footsteps on the shale behind her. She looked up. Alderman Crow stood at the edge of the trench with his hands in his coat pockets and an expression on his face that she had no difficulty reading. It was the expression of a man who had come to check on a situation he expected to have deteriorated and found instead that it was merely strange. He looked at the trench. He looked at the neat row of flat stones she was laying into it. He looked at her face, which was smudged with clay and entirely without apology. "What in God's name is this?" he asked. "Our hearth," Marin said. She did not stop working. Crow stood for a long moment in silence. He looked at the cave entrance behind her, at the growing pile of excavated material beside the trench, at the careful arrangement of tools she had propped against the rock face. He looked at the whole enterprise with the expression of a man trying to decide whether what he was witnessing was tragedy or comedy. He left without another word. By that evening, the story had traveled through Salvation Creek with the speed that stories travel in small towns in the weeks before winter, when the shrinking of the social world concentrates everything: gossip, weather, worry, commerce into a tighter and more flammable proximity. The name arrived 2 days later, carried to Marin by Owen Drummond, who was 12 years old and had appeared at the site one morning without explanation and sat himself on a flat rock at a respectful distance and watched with the focused attention of a boy who had decided this was more interesting than whatever else was available to him that day. "They're calling it Elwyn's Folly," he said. He said it without judgment, in the informational tone of a child reporting facts. "I know," Marin said. She had expected it. She had been expecting it since the morning after the council meeting, because she understood the grammar of a place like Salvation Creek well enough to know what came after the part where you accepted a worthless deed without visible despair. What came after was a name. The name was the community's way of managing its own discomfort at the situation. If what she was doing was folly, then her failure would be predictable rather than tragic, a confirmation of a judgment already rendered rather than an event requiring reassessment. Owen stayed for 2 hours that first day, eventually moving from his observational rock to the edge of the excavation, where he began unprompted to sort the flat stones she had collected from the shale field into piles by size and thickness, the thicker ones for the floor of the flue, the thinner and more regular ones for the walls, the flattest and most consistent for the capstones that would form the ceiling of the underground passage. He did not ask why. He simply sorted the stones with the methodical patience of a boy who had identified useful work and was doing it. Marin noticed. She said nothing. She kept digging. On the seventh day, Silas Drummond came. She heard him before she saw him. His footsteps were heavier than crows, more deliberate, the footsteps of a larger man with a different purpose. She straightened up from the trench and turned to look at him, and she recognized him immediately because Salvation Creek was small enough that everyone recognized everyone, and because Silas Drummond was not the kind of man who was easy to overlook. He was broad-shouldered and solid, with the careful movements of someone accustomed to working in spaces where imprecision had consequences. His tools were always good and always maintained. He built the squarest corners and the most level floors in the territory, and he knew it, and the knowing had shaped the way he occupied space in the world with the particular confidence of a craftsman who has mastered his craft and arrived at the conclusion that his way is the right way. He stood at the edge of the excavation with his arms crossed, and he looked at the trench for a long time without speaking. He looked at the line section where she had already set the capstones and backfilled the earth over them. He looked at the cave entrance. He looked at the chimney position she had marked with a stake 40 feet from the cave mouth. "Miss Elwyn," he said finally, "Mr. Drummond, I came to offer my help." His voice was careful, measured the voice of a man who was trying to be kind and finding it slightly more effortful than usual. "I've built every structure in this valley worth calling a structure. I've known this land my whole life, and I'll tell you plainly what I see." He gestured at the trench. "The ground here is a thief. It will pull every degree of warmth out of any fire you build. You are constructing a cold sink, not a hearth. And without a proper vertical chimney, you will fill that cave with smoke and choke in your sleep before February." He was not being cruel. She could hear the sincerity in it, the genuine concern of a man who believed he was watching someone make a lethal mistake. "I have spare lumber at my mill," he continued, "enough for a tight lean-to against the south face of that rock wall. Small but dry. We can build a proper fireplace, give you a vertical flue, keep it simple and proven. It will keep you alive." Marin slowly straightened up to her full height. She looked at this good and confident man, this master of a craft that was genuinely useful and genuinely useless to her specific situation, and she felt no anger at him. He was offering what he had. The problem was not his willingness, but his vocabulary. He had one language for buildings, and it was the only language he knew. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Drummond," she said. "It is generous." She paused, looking for the right words. Words her father might have used. "But the ground will not steal the heat," she said. "The ground will hold it. I am not asking the fire to heat the air. I am asking the stone to become the fire." She looked at the trench between them. "I am making the smoke pay rent for its passage. Every foot it travels underground, it pays in heat. By the time it reaches the chimney, it will have paid its tax in full." Silas stared at her. His expression had shifted from concern to something more complicated, a mixture of frustration and something else that she would only understand later when she knew him better, as the discomfort of a man confronting a logic he cannot immediately refute. "That's poetry, Miss Elwyn," he said, "not physics." "My father was a miner for 20 years, she said. "He built this system in his notes a long time before I was born. He understood heat and stone in ways that have nothing to do with poetry." "Your father, God rest him, was not a builder." "No," Marin said. "He was something else." Silas held her gaze for a long moment. He had the eyes of a man who had argued his way into the truth of things many times and had learned to recognize the point at which an argument had run its course when the person he was talking to had arrived at a position so deep-rooted that no additional argument could dislodge it. He recognized that point now. "I wish you well," he said. The words carried the weight of a different meaning underneath the literal, one the weight of a man who was fairly certain he was looking at a situation that would end badly and was performing the social ritual of hope because nothing else was available to him. He turned and walked back down the slope toward the town, his solid frame casting a long shadow back along the shale in the late afternoon light. Marin watched him go. Then she bent back to her work. 3 days later, on the 12th day of excavation, Marin heard someone on the slope above the cave and looked up to find her mother. Sina was not where anyone would have expected her to be. She was above the cave entrance on the steeper section of the slope where the loose rock gave way to the exposed face of the hillside, and she was pulling planks. Old planks. Weathered gray planks from what appeared to be a structure that had collapsed against the backside of the outcrop, hidden from the front of the slope by the angle of the rock face. A barn, Marin realized as she climbed up to see it, a barn from some earlier era of settlement that had folded under the weight of many winters, its roof long since gone, but its walls still present the wood dried and preserved by decades of shelter under the overhanging rock. Senna had already pulled 6 planks free and stacked them. She was working on a 7th, her slight frame bent over the effort, her breath visible in the cold air. Marin stood and looked at her mother working, and she felt something shift behind her sternum. A complex thing, not a single emotion, but a convergence of several at once. Grief and love, and the specific ache of seeing someone you were supposed to be protecting doing something that made protection unnecessary. The ache of discovering that the person you were trying to carry was carrying something at the same time. "You should have told me," Marin said. Senna straightened up and looked at her daughter without apology. "You had enough to tell yourself," she said. They stood for a moment in the thin November light on the slope above their future home, looking at each other across the stack of salvaged wood that would become the front wall of the only shelter they were going to have, and Sina said the thing that she had perhaps been saving for exactly this moment. "You got your father's mind," she said. "You got my hands, too. Use both." And then she bent back to the plank she had been working on, and after a moment Marin bent with her, and they pulled it free together from the wall of the old barn and added it to the stack, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed to be said. The days that followed were the hardest and the most clarifying of Marin Elwin's life to that point. They completed the flue. 40 feet of underground passage lined with flat stones, set in clay mortar, sealed and backfilled, so that the only indication of its presence was a slight regularity in the ground surface that no one who did not know to look for it would ever notice. They built a firebox inside the cave, a small controlled structure of stone and clay with a heavy slate top that served double duty as a cooking surface designed to burn small quantities of wood at high efficiency rather than large quantities at low efficiency. They built a chimney stack, 3 feet of stone and clay mortared into a simple column 40 feet from the cave mouth, rising from the apparently empty ground like a misplaced grave marker. When Marin looked at it, she thought it looked exactly like what it was, the exhaust point of something buried and important. They built the front wall, Senna and Marin working together, fitting the salvaged planks into a frame that Marin cut and assembled, using her father's tools with the competence of someone who had watched those tools used carefully for years. They stuffed every seam with dried moss and mud and straw. They hung the door solid tight, mounted on hinges that were the last thing of monetary value they still possessed and had chosen to spend on function rather than hold back as reserve. The window was a single pane of glass, small and precious, traded for Sina's silver locket, the last piece of jewelry she had brought from Poland, a gift from her own mother, something she had intended to give Marin when Marin was married. "Marin," Senna said when Marin came to her with the proposal. "We need the glass more than I need a locket," Marin said. "It was your grandmother's." "She would understand," Marin said. She was a practical woman. Senna looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she unclasped the locket from around her neck and placed it in Marin's hand without another word, and Marin went to trade it, and when she came back with the glass, she fitted it into the frame she had built in the plank wall with the care of someone fitting a jewel into a setting, because it was. When the wall was complete, and the door was hung, and the glass was set, the bear's throat was sealed. Their stone room existed. The sky the day they moved in was the color of a bruised dark purple and gray from horizon to horizon, with the low flattened look of a sky that had something heavy to deliver and was waiting for the right moment. The temperature had dropped overnight to a point that had no reasonable name other than serious. The path to Coldwater Bluff had a new quality, the tight-packed quality of ground that had frozen solid and was not going to thaw until April. They had almost nothing to carry. 2 bedrolls, a crate of potatoes and dried beans that represented most of their remaining food, a few iron pots, K. Elwyn's journal wrapped in oilcloth. They carried it all in 2 trips. Marin built the first fire with a handful of dry juniper branches, a quantity of fuel so small that it would have been laughable as the heating strategy for any conventional structure. She lit the kindling at the mouth of the firebox and watched the small flame take hold and grow, and then she watched the smoke. The smoke did not billow. The smoke did not hesitate. It moved immediately toward the mouth of the flue in a smooth, purposeful flow, pulled by the temperature differential between the interior of the system and the colder outside air, pulled by the draw of the chimney 40 feet away. It vanished into the underground passage with a sound that was somewhere between a whisper and a deep, satisfied sound, the sound of a system doing what it was designed to do. The draw was powerful, more powerful than she had calculated. The fire burned cleaner and hotter than it should have because the draw was supplying it with exactly the volume of air it needed, and no more down. The flames were the color of the center of things, blue and white at the base, gold above, and almost entirely smokeless. Marin sat back on her heels and watched it burn. And then she waited. The first hour, nothing. The cave was cold. The second hour, still cold. Senna had wrapped herself in both bedrolls and was sitting against the rear wall with her eyes closed. Her breathing was even, which meant she was not panicking, which was something. The third hour, Marin got up from where she had been sitting and put her hand on the floor of the cave near the firebox. The stone was cold. She moved her hand along the path of the buried flue, slowly feeling for any change in temperature. Her hand traveled a foot, 2 feet, 5 feet. Cold, cold, cold. She went back to the journal. The stone is a miser. It takes a long time to fill its pockets. She fed 3 more branches into the firebox. Small branches, precisely the amount required. She waited. It was very late past midnight. By the position of the stars she could see through the small window when she felt it. She was lying on her bedroll with the journal open on her chest, not reading, simply present, with the darkness and the sound of her mother's quiet breathing, when she became aware of something that was the absence of a thing rather than the presence of one. The deep, penetrating cold that had been radiating from the stone floor into her bed rolled through the canvas, the specific cold of ground that had been cold since November and intended to remain cold until May was gone. It was not warm, the floor was not warm, but it was not cold in the way that it had been cold. She rolled onto her hands and knees and pressed both palms flat against the stone surface. Neutral, room temperature. She moved her palms along the floor, following the path of the buried flue she could not see, and 3 feet from the firebox she felt it, a faint, nearly imperceptible warmth, bleeding upward through 6 inches of packed earth and flat stone. The first installment of the thermal debt the mountain had been accumulating for 12 hours. The miser was beginning to open its pockets. Marin sat in the dark room that smelled of clean juniper smoke and old stone, and she pressed her palms against the warming floor of the mountain, and she felt the particular relief of someone who has staked everything on their father's judgment and found that the judgment was sound. She did not wake Senna. She sat in the dark and let the warmth rise, and she thought about the man who had figured this out 20 years ago in the tunnels of a Welsh coal mine, who had proposed it and been refused and carried it in a journal through an ocean crossing in a decade in Montana, and had died before he could show anyone that it worked. It worked, Kai. The stone floor of the mountain was warm under her hands. It worked. The morning after the warmth came, Marin did not speak of it. She rose before Senna and rebuilt the fire with the same measured economy as the night before, a handful of dry juniper. Nothing more, the minimum fuel required to maintain the thermal exchange that was now occurring 24 hours a day beneath their feet. She watched the smoke disappear into the flue with the same clean, purposeful draw, and she put her palm against the floor, where she had felt the warmth the night before, and the warmth was still there. Not stronger yet, but present, persistent. The mountain was holding what it had been given. Senna emerged from her bedroll and stood in the cave room and was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone assessing conditions before committing to an assessment. She looked at the fire, small and controlled in its stone box. She looked at the window where a thin gray light was beginning to arrive from outside. Then she looked at Marin. "How is it?" she asked. "Working," Marin said. Senna nodded once. She went to the stovetop and put water on for tea. No celebration, no elaboration. Working was enough. Working was everything. The days that followed settled into the particular rhythm of lives organized entirely around survival, which is a rhythm that has no room for anything superfluous and therefore has a kind of severe clarity to it. They woke before light. Marin managed the fire, fed it 3 times a day with small, precise quantities of wood enough to maintain the constant thermal input the system required, never more than what was needed. Senna cooked what they had, which was potatoes and dried beans, and the occasional addition of whatever Marin could trap on the slope or trade in town on her infrequent trips down. The cave was cold in the mornings, genuinely cold, the stone walls holding the chill of the previous night against the slow work of the warming floor. But it was a different cold from outside cold. It was bounded and manageable. It had limits. And as the days passed and the thermal mass of the floor continued to absorb and accumulate the heat that the buried flue delivered to it through 16 hours of daily firing, the cold in the mornings became less severe, and the evenings became something closer to comfortable, and the nights became something that Marin had not expected and had not dared to calculate into her estimates. The nights became warm, not the aggressive dry warmth of a roaring fire that scorched everything nearest it and left the far corners untouched. Something more even and more persistent. The warmth came from below, which meant it came from everywhere at once, which meant there were no cold spots to retreat from, no distance from the fire beyond which the cold reasserted itself. The floor was the radiator, and the floor was everywhere, and by the end of the second week of November, the cave maintained a temperature that required no coat to be comfortable during the day and no extra blankets to sleep through the night. Marin had calculated this was possible. To experience it was a different matter entirely. She spent those first weeks in a state of controlled attention that was something like vigilance and something like wonder, monitoring the system, constantly noting the variables, adjusting the firing schedule by increments when the external temperature dropped or the wind changed direction. She kept notes in the back pages of her father's journal, not the emotional notes of someone recording an experience, but the technical notes of someone managing a process, columns of numbers, and small diagrams and observations written in the margins, in the precise angular script that she had inherited, along with most of everything else useful about herself, from Kay Elwyn. Owen Drummond came back, not once but repeatedly and not apologetically, arriving on the path from town in the late afternoon, several times each week, with the matter-of-fact air of someone who had decided this was a thing they were going to do and was not particularly interested in justifying the decision to anyone who might ask. He was 12 years old, and he had the particular quality of certain 12-year-olds that is distinct from both childhood and adolescence, an earnest, focused intelligence that had not yet been redirected into the social performances that older ages required. His father had told him not to come. He came anyway. Marin did not ask him to explain himself or to help. She simply let him be present in the way that a person can be present in a working space without being in the way, finding tasks that needed doing, filling them without instruction, taking himself out of her path when her path required the space he occupied. He was good at being useful without drawing attention to his usefulness, which was, she thought, a quality that most adults spent a long time acquiring, and this boy seemed to have arrived with. He sorted stones. He carried water from the creek at the base of the slope, a walk of half a mile and back with 2 full buckets, a task that was significant for a 12-year-old, and which he performed without complaint on the days when Marin's work kept her too close to the cave to make the trip herself. He identified without being asked that the front wall needed additional chinking along the north edge, where the wind was finding a way in, and he spent an entire afternoon filling the gaps with a mixture of clay and dried grass while Marin was working on the firebox modifications she was still refining. He asked questions, not the questions of someone performing curiosity for social reasons, but the questions of someone whose mind had genuinely engaged with a problem and was working through it in real-time, questions that required real answers and received them. "Why does the smoke go down into the ground instead of up?" he asked one afternoon watching the fire draw. "Because down is where the cold air is," Marin said, "and cold air is denser than warm air. The chimney 40 feet away is colder than the firebox in here. The difference in temperature creates a pull. The smoke follows the pull." He thought about this. "So you're tricking the smoke." "I'm using what the smoke wants to do anyway," Marin said. The smoke wants to go toward cold. I've arranged it so that in order to reach the cold it wants, it has to travel 40 feet through stone first. Owen was quiet for a moment, working through the logic. And the stone takes the heat from it while it travels. The stone takes the heat, yes. So by the time the smoke comes out the chimney, it's already cold. Mostly cold. It's been stripped of most of what it carried. He nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing information accurately. That's why your chimney doesn't make black smoke, he said. I've been watching it. Everyone in town has a chimney that goes black in the mornings. Yours makes almost nothing. Because almost nothing is being wasted, Marin said. The black smoke you see from the other chimneys is unburned fuel. It's heat that went up instead of into the room. Owen was silent for a long moment, his hands still on the clay he had been mixing. My father says you're going to freeze, he said. His voice was careful and neutral, the voice of someone reporting a fact rather than endorsing one. I know, Marin said. I don't think he's right. I know that too. He went back to his clay, and she went back to her firebox calculations, and neither of them said anything more about Silas Drummond's opinion, because neither of them needed to. The floor of the cave was warm under their knees. The fire was burning clean and efficient in its stone box. The system was doing what the system was supposed to do, and the opinion of the town's master builder, however sincerely held, was operating in a different register from physics. Physics did not hold opinions. It held facts. Senna watched the boy with a quiet attention that Marin noticed and understood. Senna had the particular observational gift of a woman who had spent her adult life in a country that was not her own, which had trained her to read character quickly and accurately because the cost of misreading it had always been high. She watched Owen Drummond carry water and sort stones and ask questions and process answers, and she arrived at her own conclusions without sharing them. One afternoon, she made him tea from the dried herbs she kept in a small cloth sack and set it on the slate surface of the stovetop without comment and went back to her mending. Owen looked at the cup for a moment, then picked it up and drank it, and that was all. But after that, he stayed later on the days he came, and the atmosphere in the cave when he was there had a slightly different quality, less like supervision and more like company. Marin noticed this too. She was grateful for it in a way she could not entirely account for because she had not thought she needed company and had not noticed the absence of it until it was no longer absent. The weeks of solitary excavation had been fine, had been what was required, but the cave with 3 people in it felt qualitatively different from the cave with 2. It felt occupied rather than inhabited. It felt, despite everything, like a place where life was happening rather than merely continuing. She was careful not to think too much about this because thinking too much about comfort was a way of creating a vulnerability that the winter had not yet found and would certainly look for. There was wood to manage. That was the thing she allowed herself to focus on. The fuel requirement of the system was, as she had calculated, dramatically lower than any conventional heating method would have demanded. She had built a small wood store against the south-facing rock at the back of the cave, a protected space where the fuel could remain dry, and what she had put into it in the first 2 weeks was already half of what a family in Salvation Creek would have consumed in 3 days. This was not a small thing. In a winter that might last 5 months or more, the difference between her fuel consumption and the town's was the difference between adequate supply and constant anxiety. She went to town twice in November to trade for additional food. On both occasions, she noted the quality of attention she received on the main street had shifted from the pitying curiosity of October into something slightly different, in more guarded watchfulness. The attention of people who had expected a situation to resolve in a predictable direction and were not yet certain why it had not. The name Elwyn's Folly had not disappeared. But people said it with slightly less conviction now, or perhaps it was only that she was better at hearing the difference between conviction and performance. Either way, she conducted her transactions, took what she needed, and walked back up the slope to Coldwater Bluff with the steady pace of someone who has somewhere specific and important to be. December arrived. The real December, the Montana December, that separated the functional members of a community from those who had built badly or planned poorly. The temperature dropped in the first week to levels that froze the creek solid overnight and turned the mud of the main street into iron and cracked the bark of the younger aspens with sounds like rifle shots in the pre-dawn cold. The smoke from every chimney in Salvation Creek rose in straight columns in the still air, visible from miles away, each column a declaration of a fire consuming more wood than it should in order to produce less warmth than was needed. At Coldwater Bluff, the cave had reached what Marin had come to think of in her father's language as its equilibrium. 65 degrees roughly, not a number she had measured with any instrument more sophisticated than her own body's reliable calibration, but a number she was confident in because her body had been calibrated by years of work and exposure, and the development of the kind of physical awareness that comes from paying attention to temperatures as practical information rather than mere sensation. The floor was uniformly warm from the firebox to the far wall. The walls, which had been cold to the touch in October, were now merely cool, the thermal mass of the mountain transmitting the floor's warmth upward through the stone by the same conductive process that had charged the floor in the first place. She maintained the fire with 3 small feedings daily, morning, midday, evening. Each feeding a handful of wood enough to keep the flue system at its operating temperature, enough to top off the thermal battery without overwhelming it. The total wood consumed in a day was what a large cabin fireplace would have burned in 2 hours. Senna's cough was changing, not gone, not absent, but changing in character, losing the rattling, desperate quality that had been its signature through the cold and damp of the previous 2 winters. The air inside the cave was warm and still and dry, not the dry of a forced air system that parched the throat, but the dry of stone and equilibrium, the clean mineral-scented air of the deep earth that had none of the wood smoke and cold drafts and chronic dampness of the cabin they had left. Marin watched her mother's breathing at night without being obvious about it, and what she noticed was a gradual smoothing of the process, a reduction in the effort required, a quiet improvement in the fundamental quality of rest. Senna did not comment on this, neither did Marin. Some improvements were too important to speak about until they were certain. Owen came less frequently in December because the path was harder, and his absence from the household was more difficult to explain in cold weather when there was less reason to be away. But he came when he could, and when he came he worked, and when he was done working, he sat at the small table where Marin wrote her notes, and he read the portions of Kai Elwyn's journal that she was willing to show him, which was most of it because Owen read with the focused respect of someone who understood they were in the presence of a mind that had thought more carefully about certain things than anyone else they had access to. One afternoon, he looked up from the journal and said, "Has anyone ever built anything like this before?" "My father thought the Romans used a version of it," Marin said. "He found a reference in a book he got from the library in Butte. Underground heating channels beneath stone floors. They called it something, I can't remember the word. He wrote it down somewhere in the earlier pages." Owen turned back to the beginning of the journal, moving through it with the careful patience of someone who had decided to find a specific thing and was not going to stop until they did. It took him 20 minutes. "Hypocaust," he said. "That's the word." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the page. "So this isn't new," he said. "My father said good ideas are never new," Marin said. "They're just forgotten. The trick is remembering them at the right time." Owen set the journal down and looked at the cave around him, the warm stone walls, the small clean fire, the floor that radiated its steady, gentle heat into the air above it. And he looked at it with the expression of someone seeing a thing clearly for perhaps the first time. "People are going to want to know how to do this," he said. "Let them get through the winter first," Marin said. It was the 12th of December when Alderman Crow came. Marin heard him on the path. His footsteps had a distinctive quality. She had learned to recognize the careful, deliberate steps of a man who was accustomed to walking on surfaces that rewarded confidence and was adjusting his manner accordingly to terrain that did not. She was inside when she heard him working on a modification to the firebox air intake that she had been considering for a week. She put down her tools and waited. The knock was not the knock of a man who needed something. It was the knock of a man exercising a prerogative, checking on something that fell within the scope of his authority to check on. She opened the door. The cold outside arrived first, as it always did, a brief, hard pressure of air against the warm interior atmosphere. Then Crow in his good coat and his banker's eyes standing on the step she had built of flat stone in front of the threshold. His expression was the expression she had last seen at the council meeting, the careful managerial neutrality of a man conducting an inspection. He had come, she understood immediately, because the story of Elwyn's folly had not resolved in the way the story was supposed to resolve, and a man in Crow's position monitored stories that did not resolve as expected. "Miss Elwyn," he said. "Mr. Crow." He looked past her into the cave. He took a moment to look, and Marin watched his eyes move through the space the way his eyes moved through everything, cataloging, assessing, calculating. He saw her mother at the table with a book, wearing a single wool dress and no shawl. He saw the small fire in the stone box, barely visible from the doorway. He saw the lamp burning on the table with a steadiness that indicated no draft, no competing air movement. He saw the bedrolls neatly folded against the wall, not piled with the multiple blankets of a space where the cold reached into sleep. He stepped inside. She did not invite him. She simply did not block him, which amounted to the same thing under the social grammar of Salvation Creek. Crow moved into the cave with the measured step of someone making a formal assessment. He looked at the walls. He reached out and placed his hand against the stone surface. The instinctive gesture she had come to realize that anyone with a practical relationship to building made. When they entered a space they did not understand because the stone told you things that the air and the eye did not. He held his hand against the wall for a longer moment than was casual. Then he looked at the floor. Then he turned toward the door and looked at the single thin column of vapor rising from the chimney stack 40 feet away, barely visible against the pewter sky, nearly nothing. His face was still. It was the stillness of a man recalculating something significant. He turned to look at Marin. She met his eyes and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying, and because everything that was true about the situation was present in the room and required no elaboration. Crow's gaze moved to the firebox, the modest, clean-burning structure in its stone housing that controlled air intake that maintained it at operating temperature with minimum fuel. He looked at the small pile of wood in the store beside it, a very small pile for the 12th of December. "How much wood have you burned this month?" he said. "Enough," Marin said. It was not an evasion. It was a precise answer. She had burned enough, not more, not less. The system required what it required and consumed nothing beyond that, and the word enough was the most accurate description of the relationship between fuel and necessity that she had been able to establish. Crow looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Senna, who had not looked up from her book. He looked at the warm air, which was visibly different from the air outside in the way that all warm, still air is different from cold-moving air. It had a quality of completeness to it, of sufficiency, that outside air in December in Montana fundamentally lacked. He took the deed from his inner coat pocket. Marin's attention sharpened to a point. He looked at the document for a moment, then placed it on the table beside Senna's book. Senna looked at it. She looked at Crow. She did not touch it. "A copy," Crow said, "for your records." His voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, a quality she would need time to name, something that occupied the space between acknowledgement and calculation. "The original remains with the county recorder in Helena, as is proper." He straightened his coat. "The land is yours," he said, "as agreed, free and clear." He said it the same way he had said it in October in the town hall, with the same words and the same intonation. But the words meant something different now, and both of them knew it. In October, they had been the valediction of a man handing a condemned person their sentence. Now they were something else, a fact being stated in the presence of evidence that had changed its meaning, a legal formula that had acquired weight it had not carried when it was first spoken. Crow left. Marin stood at the door and watched him make his way back down the slope toward the town, his figure diminishing against the white and gray of the December landscape, his footsteps deliberate and careful on the frozen ground. When he was gone, she took the deed from the table and went to the place where she kept the important papers, a tin box tucked into a natural shelf in the cave wall, the kind of storage that rock provided and wood did not, dry and protected and constant. She placed the deed inside it. She placed beside it the original deed from October and the letter from the county recorder and every document she had been given or had obtained that related to the land and its ownership. She closed the lid. She thought about the calculations she had seen Crow making with his eyes and his hands in the 30 seconds he had stood in this room. She thought about what a man like Crow did when he encountered a situation that had resolved unexpectedly. She did not know what the calculation was. She knew that there was one and that it was continuing, and that the tin box was in the shelf of the rock wall where it needed to be. Senna said from the table without looking up from her book, "He will come again." Yes, Marin said. Be ready. I am ready. Senna turned a page. The week before Christmas, Owen came on a Wednesday afternoon and stayed until the early dark fell over the slope, and the temperature dropped by 15 degrees in an hour, in the way that December evenings in Montana could drop without ceremony or warning. Marin told him to stay until the temperature stabilized rather than make the walk back to town in the worst of it, and he stayed, and the three of them ate potatoes and bean soup at the small table, while the wind that had come up from the north tested the joints of the front wall and found them sufficient. Owen was quiet through most of the meal, which was not unusual. He was a boy who processed things silently rather than aloud, which was in Marin's experience a much rarer quality than most people understood. But toward the end of the meal, he looked up at her across the table with an expression that contained something he had been sitting with for a while. My father is building 3 new cabins, he said, for the Mercer family and the Hawthorne family and the Deacon family who came in September. He started last month. Marinator soup. Log cabins, Owen said. Same as always. Yes, Marin said. He was looking at her steadily. He was asking something with his eyes that he was not asking with his mouth. And she looked back at him and understood the question, and she understood also why he was not asking it directly, because the answer to the direct question implicated his father in a way that a 12-year-old boy was not yet equipped to navigate cleanly. She gave him the answer anyway because he deserved it. Your father builds what he knows how to build, she said. He builds it well. The cabins will be solid, and the people inside them will be warm enough. She paused. They will use a great deal of wood to stay that way, but they will stay that way. Owen nodded slowly. Warm enough, he said, tasting the qualifier. Warm enough, Marin said. He thought about this for a moment. Is warm enough, he asked. It was not a child's question despite being asked by a child. It was a question about the relationship between sufficiency and excellence, between the standard that met the immediate requirement and the standard that met it better, and whether meeting it better mattered when the cost of meeting it at all was already high. This winter, yes, Marin said. Ask me again after the winter. After Owen had gone, Marin sat at the table with the journal open before her and the lamp casting its steady light across the pages, and she thought about what the winter was going to ask of Salvation Creek. Not this winter in the abstract, but the specific winter that was coming, the one that the sky had been promising for weeks in the particular blue-black quality of its clouds at sunset, the one that the animals on the slope seemed to know was imminent, in the way that animals knew things before the instruments registered them. Her father had written about the children's blizzard, though not by that name. He had not lived to see. It would not see it had died 2 years before it arrived. But he had written in the winter passages of his journal about the nature of Montana cold and what it required of structures that intended to shelter human beings through it. He had written with the matter-of-fact clarity of a man who had spent enough time underground in Wales to understand that the difference between shelter and sufficient shelter was not a small difference, that the gap between them was precisely the width of the gap between living and not living. The tree fights the wind and breaks, he had written in one of the final pages. The mountain does not fight the cold. It absorbs the sun and remembers its warmth. She had read that line many times. She understood it differently now, with the warm floor under her feet and the mountain stones surrounding her, than she had understood it in October. He was not talking about caves. He was not talking about construction techniques or thermal mass or the physics of conductive heat transfer. He was talking about a fundamental orientation toward difficulty, the difference between opposing a force directly and incorporating it into a system where its energy became useful. The conventional approach to Montana cold was to fight it. You built a fire. The cold pushed. You built a bigger fire. The cold pushed harder. The battle was continuous and expensive and required constant vigilance, and any failure of supply or attention meant immediate defeat. The mountain did not fight the cold. The mountain accepted the cold and held within itself the accumulated memory of every warm day it had experienced and released that memory slowly and steadily through the cold months. And when the cold finally passed, it was unchanged, not exhausted by the struggle, not diminished by the contest, simply present and constant in the way that the deep things were present and constant. Be the mountain. She fed the fire its evening portion and banked it for the night and went to her bedroll, and she lay in the warm dark of the cave and listened to Sina breathing, and the breathing was clear and even and untroubled, and she thought about the 3 new log cabins that Silas Drummond was building on the south side of Salvation Creek their walls full of the small gaps and inefficiencies of the conventional craft, their fireplaces ready to consume everything that was fed to them and return a fraction of it as heat to the small cold rooms. She did not think about this with satisfaction. She thought about it with something closer to apprehension, because the sky had that quality in the evenings now, that specific bruised and pregnant quality that her father had described in his winter journal entries. And she had been watching it for 2 weeks, and what she saw in it was not the ordinary winter of gradual accumulation and managed cold, but something larger and less manageable, gathering itself above the high peaks, waiting for the right arrangement of pressure systems to release it. She had no instrument for measuring atmospheric pressure. She had no instrument for measuring wind direction at altitude. She had only the specific education of a girl who had grown up in the shadow of mountains with a father who read the sky the way he read rock, looking for the signs of forces that were not yet visible on the surface, but were expressing themselves in subtle ways to those who knew the language. She lay in the dark, and she listened to the wind test the front wall of the cave, and she thought about the mountain's memory, and she thought about what was coming, and she fed one more small piece of wood into the firebox before she allowed herself to sleep. January arrived without ceremony. The first week was cold in the sustained businesslike way of deep winter temperatures that did not vary much between day and night, a sky that held its gray flatness against the valley without drama, a wind that came and went according to rhythms that had nothing to do with human comfort or inconvenience. Salvation Creek functioned in this cold with the practiced stoicism of a community that had been through Montana winters before and knew the vocabulary of them. Owen came on the 8th of January, a Sunday, and he was quieter than usual. He helped Marin with the reorganization of the wood store she had been planning, shifting the supply into a more accessible arrangement that would allow her to reach the required daily quantity without excessive movement. It was a small task that took an hour, and when it was done, he sat at the table and drank the tea that Senna put before him, and he looked at the fire and he did not talk much. "Your father is worried," Marin said, not a question. Owen looked up. "About what? About what's coming?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "He keeps going out to the woodpile and counting." Marin nodded. "He thinks it's not enough," Senna said from her corner. "He thinks it should be enough," Owen said carefully. "He doesn't know if it is." The distinction was a real one, and the fact that a 12-year-old had made it accurately said something about the quality of attention Owen Drummond brought to the world around him. There was a difference between a supply that should meet an expected demand and a supply that would meet an actual demand, and the gap between the two was where most disasters lived. "Go home before dark," Marin said. Owen went home before dark. On the 11th of January, Marin stood outside the cave in the late afternoon and looked at the sky to the northwest, and what she saw there stopped her where she stood. It was not a specific thing, not a formation or a color that would have meant something to a meteorologist. It was the quality of light at the horizon, which had a greenish cast that was neither the green of aurora nor the green of vegetation, but the specific green of a sky that was doing something unusual with the light it was receiving from above. The clouds at the high altitude were moving in a direction that was different from the clouds at the low altitude, which meant the wind systems at different levels had diverged, which meant the upper atmosphere was in the process of reorganizing itself around a pressure differential that was larger than the ordinary pressure differentials of winter. Her father had written about this quality of light. He had noted it 3 times in his winter journals, always in the days before extreme weather, and each time he had noted the same thing, that the difference between ordinary Montana cold and extraordinary Montana cold was not a matter of degree, but a matter of kind. She went inside. She spent the evening doing the same arithmetic she had already done several times but had not yet committed to acting on: the supply of wood in the store, the rate of consumption required to maintain the system at operating temperature, the possible duration of an extreme cold event, the margin between adequate supply and insufficient supply. The margin was comfortable if the event lasted 3 days. The margin was tight if the event lasted longer. She added wood to the store the next morning, making 2 trips down the slope to the scrub timber on the eastern edge of the property that she had been holding in reserve. It was not much additional supply, but it was what was available, and she had always operated on the principle that the gap between enough and almost enough was worth every effort required to close it. On the morning of the 12th of January, she woke at 4 in the morning because the sound had changed. Not the sound outside that had changed too, and she would register it in a moment. The sound inside, the particular acoustic quality of the cave when the external environment altered its pressure relationships with the interior. A slight change in the draw of the flue, not enough to affect its function, but enough to be perceptible to someone who had been living with the system's sounds for 2 months and had learned to hear the difference between its normal register and its adjusted one. She lay still for a moment and listened. Outside, the wind had arrived. Not the measured directional wind of ordinary winter, the wind that came from a specific quadrant and held its character through the day. This was something else. She could hear it above the cave, the sound of air moving in volume over the rock face, a sound that was more felt than heard at this distance. From the surface, a low vibration that transmitted itself through the stone of the mountain, in the way that deep sound always transmits itself through dense material. And beneath the vibration, occasionally a sound that was higher and harder, the sound of loose material being moved, of the world's surface being reorganized by something that was not asking permission. Marin got up. She added wood to the fire, not the morning ration, but the full morning ration, plus an additional quantity enough to bring the system to its maximum operating temperature rather than its maintenance temperature. She checked the front wall, moving her hands along every seam and joint she had packed with moss and clay, in November, feeling for the cold air that would indicate a breach. The wall held. She checked the door. She checked the window. She went to the tin box and checked that the deed was where she had put it, which it was, and that the documents were dry, which they were. Then she went to the window and looked out at the darkness. What she saw was white, not the white of moonlight on snow, the white of snow in motion, the specific whiteness of a sky that had decided to become a wall that had erased the distinction between air and ground and filled the space between them with a continuous, blinding, unnavigable substance that was no longer weather in any ordinary sense of the word. The chimney stack 40 feet away, which she checked every morning as the first act of her day, was invisible. The rock face above the cave was invisible. The path down the slope toward town was invisible. There was no path down the slope toward town. There was only the cave and the warmth that rose from the floor, and the clean small fire in its stone box, and the system working the way the system was supposed to work, and beyond the front wall, the mountain that did not fight the cold. She went back to her bedroll. She lay down in the warmth of the cave floor and listened to the blizzard rebuild the world outside, and she thought about Salvation Creek below its log cabins and their large hungry fireplaces, their wood piles stacked along south walls, their gaps and drafts, and the fundamental inefficiency of every structure in the valley except this one. She thought about Owen Drummond, 12 years old at home with his father. She thought about Silas Drummond's woodpile, which Owen had told her his father was counting. She thought about what counting a woodpile meant when the thermometer was dropping faster than it should be able to drop, when the wind was doing what this wind was doing, when the sky had delivered not the expected winter, but the other winter, the one that came once in a generation and left a mark on the memory of everyone who survived it. The floor of the cave was warm. Marin lay in its warmth and watched the darkness at the window, where the snow was so thick it had its own luminescence, a pale gray light that was not quite light, and she waited for morning in the knowledge that morning was going to bring with it things she was not yet able to see clearly, but was in the most fundamental sense prepared for. Her father had taught her this. You could not prepare for every specific thing the winter would send. You could not anticipate every particular difficulty or provision against every precise contingency. What you could do was understand the principles well enough that when the specific thing arrived, whatever specific thing it turned out to be, you had built something that was equal to it, not because you had predicted it, but because you had understood deeply and correctly how heat and stone and fire and cold related to one another in the world. The mountain does not fight the cold. Outside, the blizzard consumed the world. Inside, the floor was warm, and the fire burned clean, and Senna slept without coughing, and the system that Kai Elwyn had designed in a Welsh mining district and carried across an ocean in a leather-bound journal and never lived to see built, was doing in the Montana cold exactly what he had always known it could do. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The blizzard lasted 3 days. This is the fact that history recorded, the one that made it into the county records and the territorial newspapers, and the letters that survivors wrote to relatives in other states in the weeks afterward, when the Postal Service resumed and the roads became passable again, and the full accounting of what had happened could finally be assembled from the fragments of individual experience. 3 days, 72 hours from the first wall of white that erased the horizon on the morning of January 12th to the moment when the wind finally exhausted itself and the sky cleared to the specific hard blue of a Montana winter in the aftermath of violence. The temperature during those 3 days reached levels that the available instruments were not calibrated to measure with certainty. What was certain was that livestock in barns and shelters throughout the valley died from cold faster than the cold should have been able to kill them, which was the kind of datum that told you something precise about how far outside the expected range the temperatures were operating. What was certain was that the wind moved through the valley at speeds that stripped wooden structures of their surface materials and drove fine snow through gaps that had never leaked before, gaps that no reasonable person had considered gaps, because they were too small to matter under ordinary conditions and were not small enough to matter now. What was certain was that the wood ran out, not everywhere at once and not immediately, but with the progressive and remorseless logic of a calculation that had been wrong from the beginning. Wrong not in its daily arithmetic, but in its underlying assumption, which was that the winter being provisioned for was the ordinary winter and not this one. The Mercer family's new log cabin, which Silas Drummond had completed in November, and considered among his finest recent work, went through its entire wood supply in 36 hours. The Hawthorne family burned their furniture on the second day, working through the chairs first, and then the table, and then the shelving, and then the bed frames, maintaining a fire that kept the temperature inside the cabin at a level where the children could survive without frostbite, but where no one was comfortable and where the margin between surviving and not surviving was visible from where they stood. Throughout Salvation Creek, the same story played out in variations. Families who had thought they were provisioned until March discovered that the calculation had assumed a winter with a different arithmetic. The hardware of daily life, the firewood stacked along south walls, the coal in basement bins, the carefully managed reserves that had seemed adequate in October, was consumed at rates that the cold dictated without reference to what anyone had planned or hoped. The town's better-built structures fared better and failed later. But they failed. Silas Drummond's house was the last to fail because Silas Drummond had built it himself and had built it to a standard that exceeded everything else in the valley, and because he had stacked his woodpile with the thoroughness of a man who took provision seriously, and because his instinct on the 11th of January, when the sky had that quality, and Owen had come home from somewhere without explaining where he had been, and Silas had found himself going back to the woodpile for the third time that day to count, had been correct. He had spent the 12th, the full first day of the blizzard, feeding the great stone fireplace with the controlled discipline of a builder who understood fire management and was applying everything he knew to the problem of keeping his family warm. His wife and 3 children gathered in the largest room of the house, the room with the fireplace moving only when necessary, conserving warmth with the instinctive efficiency of people who had registered the seriousness of what was outside without being told directly. Owen was among them, saying nothing, watching the fire with the steady attention that Silas had noticed in his son for years, and had never entirely understood the quality of looking at things as though they were problems that had solutions rather than facts that had to be accepted. On the morning of the second day, Silas went to the woodpile and found it reduced to a quantity that, at the rate the fireplace was consuming fuel, would last until early the following morning. He stood in the wind at the back of the house with the cold coming through every layer he had on him, like a thing with intelligence, like something that knew where the barriers were and had spent the previous 36 hours identifying the thin places, and he counted the remaining wood with the methodical precision of a man who needed the number to be different from what it was, and was checking his arithmetic for the third time in case he had made an error. He had not made an error. He went back inside. He sat in the room with his family and the fire, and the cold that was finding its way in through gaps he would have sworn did not exist, and he thought with the systematic rigor of a builder approaching a structural problem. What were the options? What were their costs? What was the most critical variable? What could be addressed and what could not? The most critical variable was Owen. Owen had been running a fever since the afternoon of the first day. Not a dangerous fever, not yet, but a fever of the kind that announced its intentions clearly to a parent who was paying attention, a fever that said it knew where it was going and was working its way there methodically. His breathing was slightly labored. His color was not good. Silas had seen children die from fevers that started like this in winters that were not as extreme as this one. He fed another log into the fire. On the morning of the third day, the wood was gone. Not nearly gone, not almost gone. Gone. The last piece had gone into the fireplace at 3 in the morning, and by 6, the fire had consumed it and was consuming its own coals, and the temperature inside the house had begun its rapid descent toward the temperature outside the house, which had no floor. Silas dressed his children in everything that was available. He wrapped his wife in blankets. Owen, feverish and barely conscious, he kept in the center of the room, away from the walls, surrounded by every piece of fabric in the house, arranged as insulation around his bedroll. His color had worsened through the night. The breathing was slower than it should have been and more effortful. Silas stood in the center of his best-built house, the finest structure in Salvation Creek, and he looked at his son, and he looked at the dead fireplace, and he looked at the walls he had built with such care and pride, and he understood with a precision that was almost physical the nature of the mistake he had made. Not the mistake of insufficient wood, though he had made that mistake too. The foundational mistake, the one that had made all the other mistakes possible. He had confused mastery of a craft with mastery of a problem. He knew how to build log cabins. He knew how to build them better than anyone in the territory. He had taken the knowledge of how to build log cabins and applied it to the problem of keeping people warm in Montana winters, and it had never occurred to him to ask whether log cabins were the right answer to that problem, because the question and the answer had always arrived together in his understanding, inseparable, confirmed by repetition and the authority that came from being the person everyone asked. The girl had asked the question. He had told her she was going to kill her mother. He stood in the cold room and he looked at his son's pale face, and he thought about the morning he had come to Coldwater Bluff and stood at the edge of the trench and told a 17-year-old girl that her father's thinking was poetry and not physics. He thought about the specific confidence with which he had said it, the particular quality of a man who has been wrong about something important and had deployed his certainty like a weapon against the person who happened to be right. He thought about the thin column of vapor he had seen from the ridge, barely visible against the gray sky, rising from a chimney stack 40 feet from the bear's throat on the evenings when he had happened to look in that direction. Nearly nothing. When every chimney in Salvation Creek was belching the thick black evidence of wood being converted into smoke and wasted heat, the chimney at Coldwater Bluff was producing something that was almost not there. He had seen it, and he had registered it, and he had filed it in the category of things he did not understand and could not immediately refute, and he had left it there while he continued building log cabins. He went to where his coat hung by the door. "Silas," his wife's voice from across the room. "I'm going to get help," he said. "In this, I know what I'm doing," he said, and then, because he was an honest man in his bones, even when honesty was uncomfortable, "I know where I'm going. Whether I can get there is something else." He put on his coat and his second coat over it, and his heaviest boots, and the scarf his wife had made him 3 winters ago, and the thick mittens that still smelled faintly of the animal they had come from, and he opened the door into the white. The cold hit him like a physical force, like something structural in the world that had weight and direction and intention. The wind was lower on this third day than it had been on the first. The blizzard was spending itself, as blizzards eventually did, exhausting its violence against the landscape, until it reached the point of diminishing returns and surrendered to the high pressure that was always waiting behind it. But lower was not gone, and the temperature was, if anything, more serious now than it had been at the storm's peak, the cold having had 3 days to consolidate itself into the landscape, to enter the soil and the wood and the stone of the valley, and become something persistent rather than something passing. The snow was waist-deep in the main street, hip-deep in the drifts. The path east toward Coldwater Bluff was not a path anymore. It was a theoretical line running through a landscape that had been reorganized into forms that bore no relationship to the paths and landmarks of before. He knew the direction. He went in the direction. Walking through waist-deep snow is not walking. It is a different activity that borrows the name, an activity in which each step requires the full commitment of the body and produces about a third of the forward movement that an equivalent step on clear ground would produce. Silas Drummond was a large and strong man who had spent his life doing physical work, and the walk from his house to the base of the Coldwater Bluff slope, a distance he would normally have covered in 15 minutes, took him the better part of an hour. His lungs burned from the cold air, the specific deep ache of air that was below zero entering respiratory passages designed for something less extreme. He kept his scarf over his mouth and nose and breathed through it, which helped, and he kept his eyes narrow against the glare of the snow in the thin winter light, and he kept going. He had no expectation of what he would find. He was a man who faced facts, and the fact he had been facing for most of the past 3 days in the private arithmetic that ran beneath his practical thoughts was that Maren Elwyn was 17 years old and had been living in a cave she had sealed with salvaged wood and clay packing with her sick mother, and the probability that they had survived 3 days of the worst cold in the memory of anyone living was not a probability he had allowed himself to calculate directly, because the answer it produced was one he had responsibility for and was not yet ready to hold. When he reached the eastern slope and began the climb toward Coldwater Bluff, the wind was at his back, which helped. The slope had been swept partially clear by the same aerodynamic forces that Maren had noted when she built the front wall. The configuration of the surrounding rock channeled the wind away from the immediate face of the outcrop, creating a relative zone of stillness that had prevented the catastrophic drifting that had buried many of the valley's structures. He noted this mechanically with the automatic professional attention of a builder who observes structural consequences even when his mind is occupied with other things. He was halfway up the slope when he saw it. It was small, almost nothing. A thin column of vapor rising from a point 40 feet out from the cave face, barely perceptible against the pale sky, dissipating within a few feet of its source. Not smoke, not the black heat-wasting exhaust of a fire being demanded to do more than it was designed to do. A wisp, a near nothing, the chimney stack. Silas stopped walking. He stood in the snow on the slope of Coldwater Bluff, and he looked at that thin column of vapor, and he felt something happen in his chest that he did not have a name for, and that he would not have been able to describe to anyone who asked, except to say that it was the simultaneous sensation of relief and shame that arrives when you discover that something you were certain was going wrong is going right, and that you were wrong to be certain, and that the cost of your certainty has been paid by someone else. The vapor was still rising, thin and pale and nearly invisible, but present, rising with the faint, steady steadiness of a system operating at equilibrium, rather than at crisis, a system that had not been pushed to its limits by the previous 3 days, because its limits were not where the previous 3 days had been asking it to perform. He kept climbing. The front wall of the cave was clear of snow. He registered this with the part of his mind that was always observing structure. The angle of the rock face and the orientation of the wall had created a condition where the wind carried the snow past rather than against the entrance. An aerodynamic fact that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with how carefully someone had thought about where to put the wall and how to configure it relative to the prevailing weather. He raised his right hand, the one in the thick mitten that smelled of animal, and he knocked on the plank door. The sound was flat and muffled in the enormous silence that the blizzard had left behind it, the particular acoustic dead space of a landscape buried in snow. He waited. His feet inside 2 pairs of socks and his heaviest boots had passed beyond cold into the specific numb that was not painful because it was beyond pain, and he knew he had perhaps another 30 minutes before that numbness became a serious problem. He heard movement inside. The door opened. The warmth arrived before anything else, a wave of it, not the aggressive, scorching heat of a fireplace running at full capacity in crisis mode, not the desperate, dry blast of a space being heated against its nature, but something else entirely, something that moved through him like information moving through a circuit, like the resolution of a problem that had been stated incorrectly and was suddenly being understood correctly. It was warm the way the inside of the earth was warm, not hot, not fierce, simply consistent, pervasive, present from every direction at once. Maren Elwyn stood in the doorway. She was wearing a single wool dress. No coat, no shawl, no extra layering of any kind. Her hands, which had been raw and cracked from the outdoor work of October and November, were healed. Her face was calm, with the specific calm of someone who had been inside a warm place for 3 days and had not been required to manage anything beyond the ordinary. Silas looked past her into the cave. Senna Elwyn sat at the small table with a book open before her and a cup of something warm between her hands. The lamp on the table burned with a steady, undrafted flame. The bedrolls were folded against the far wall, not piled with a desperate layering of a space where warmth was a battle being fought. The air inside was the air of a space that had been warm long enough that it was not thinking about it anymore. He looked at the floor. He had built floors in every structure in Salvation Creek. He knew floors the way he knew everything. He had built the specific quality of a plank surface, the sound it made underfoot, the relationship between flooring and the substructure beneath it. What he was looking at was not a plank floor. It was packed earth and flat stone, and it had a quality he had never encountered in a floor before, which was the quality of heat. Not heat from above radiating downward and being partially absorbed. Heat from below radiating upward and filling the space uniformly from the ground, up the way the sun heated the earth, and the earth returned what it had been given. Through the long evenings of summer, he took one step inside. He reached out with his right hand, the mitten removed without his noticing he had done it, and he placed his palm flat against the stone wall of the cave. The stone was warm, not the warmth of a surface recently heated, the deep, settled, distributed warmth of a mass that had absorbed heat over weeks and was releasing it over an equivalent period, the warmth of something that had made a commitment and was keeping it. He held his palm against the stone for a long moment, and he felt through the center of that moment the complete collapse of a framework he had spent 25 years building about what shelter was and how it worked and what a person needed to know to provide it. He turned to face her. Silas Drummond was a man who believed in accuracy in his tools and in his words, and the words that rose in him now were the only accurate words for what he needed to say, which meant they were the hardest words available to him in that moment and also the only acceptable ones. "My boy is sick," he said. His voice came out smaller than he intended, stripped of the resonance that cold and exertion and the weight of what he was saying had removed from it. "We have no more wood." He looked at her face. He looked at the calm in it, the absence of anything that resembled satisfaction or the vindication of a position long held against opposition. There was nothing in her face that said, "I told you so," which he had expected and would have deserved and could have absorbed, because men in his position absorbed what they deserved. There was only the direct measuring attention of someone assessing a problem that had arrived and required addressing. "How bad is the boy?" she said. "Fever since yesterday morning. Breathing is slow." Marin turned to her mother. Senna had already closed her book. She was standing, moving to the shelves where they kept their food stores, reaching for the pot, a practical and immediate response that contained within its promptness a complete answer to the question of what kind of person she was and what she thought the situation required. "Bring your family here," Marin said. She turned back to Silas. "There is room. It is warm." She went to the wood store and took from it a quantity of fuel. She placed it on the small sled they kept near the door for hauling supplies up the slope. "Take this back first. Get them warm enough to move. Then bring them here." She said it without hesitation and without the quality of someone conferring a favor. She said it the way a person states the next necessary step in a sequence that has a clear logic, because it was the next necessary step and the logic was clear. Silas looked at the sled. He looked at the wood she had placed on it, enough to warm the house and melt the numbness from his family's extremities and give Owen's fever the warmth it needed to either break or at least stop progressing in the wrong direction. He looked at the cave that was warm enough that the woman who lived in it wore a single dress in January. He could not speak for a moment. When he could, he said, "I told you the ground would steal the heat." "Yes," Marin said, "I was wrong." "Yes." He looked at the sled. He looked at her face. He looked at the stone wall that was warm under a hand placed flat against it in the worst cold in living memory. "How does it work?" he said, not defensively, not rhetorically. The question of a man who has just discovered that the thing he understood least was the thing he needed most, who has arrived at the absolute beginning of a new education and knows it. "I'll explain everything," Marin said, "after your family is here and Owen is warm." Silas nodded. He took the rope of the sled in his frozen hands, and he turned toward the door, and he went out into the cold again, pulling the sled behind him, the warmth of the cave already retreating behind him, in the specific way warmth retreats. When you leave it, its memory lasting just long enough to make the cold feel colder by comparison. He came back 2 hours later with his wife and his youngest daughter, and Owen wrapped in everything that remained in the house on a second sled. Two other families from the nearest part of town had attached themselves to the procession when word spread that Silas Drummond, Silas Drummond, who had built every solid structure in the Pauli and whose judgment in matters of shelter was the standard by which all other judgments were measured, was taking his family to the Elwyn Cave. Because if Silas Drummond was going there, the situation must have resolved the way only one possible resolution explained. Marin opened the door to 12 people. The cave was not large for 12 people, but it was warm, and warmth in sufficient quantity makes space that is not large feel larger than it is. Because warmth is itself a form of spaciousness, a quality of environment that reduces the pressure that cold creates, that allows bodies to relax out of the compressed, defensive posture that extreme cold imposes on them, and to occupy space naturally rather than defensively. Owen was placed on a bedroll near the firebox, not close enough to be a hazard, but in the zone where the floor was warmest, the zone directly above the buried flue. The warmth that came through the stone rose into him from below the way, sunlight from above, and the heat of the earth from below together had always been the natural system for warming living things, the system that the surface of the planet had used for the entirety of its biological history. Within an hour, his color had improved. Within 2 hours, his fever broke with the specific, decisive quality of a fever that has lost the argument it was making. He slept deeply and easily on the warm floor, his breathing clear and even. Silas watched this. He sat against the far wall of the cave with his wife beside him, and he watched his son sleep on the warm floor of the mountain, and he watched the small fire in its stone box burn with its characteristic cleanness, and he did what he had always done when he encountered something he did not understand. He looked at it with everything he had, trying to take it apart with his eyes, trying to find the joints and the principles. The way he found the joints and principles of a structure he was trying to understand how to build. The other families were quieter than 12 people usually were in a small space. The children moved carefully in the subdued way of children who have registered that something serious has happened and are responding to the quality of the adult atmosphere. The adults spoke in low voices or not at all, eating the soup that Santa had produced from their stores with the calm efficiency of a woman who had planned for additional mouths rather than being surprised by them. It was late in the evening when Silas got up and went to Marin, who was at the table with the journal open and her notes in the margins. He sat down across from her. He did not preamble. He had never been a man for preamble. "Show me how it works," he said. She looked at him. She measured him in the way she measured things directly and without social flinching, the way her father had measured things, the way of a person for whom the truth of a situation mattered more than the comfort of the people involved in it. Then she turned the journal to face him. She began with the diagram of the underground flue, tracing its outline, with her finger explaining the principle of the thermal mass in the terms her father had used, in the terms she had developed to herself over 2 months of observing the system at work. She explained the conductive heat transfer, the way the hot gases surrendered their energy to the stone in direct proportion to the length of the passage they traveled through. She explained the mechanics of why smoke flowed toward cold and how the system's geometry used that tendency rather than fighting it. Silas listened with the intensity of a man who had decided to learn something and had committed to learning it completely rather than superficially. He asked questions that were the questions of a builder, precise structural, concerned with the tolerances and the failure modes and the conditions under which the system would and would not work. They were good questions. They were the questions that her father would have wanted someone to ask, the questions that pushed the knowledge into its operational details rather than its general principles. She answered everything. Around them, the cave held its warmth, and the family slept or spoke quietly, and Owen breathed steadily on his warm floor. And outside, the blizzard had spent itself entirely, and the sky had cleared to the sharp, cold, indifferent blue of the aftermath. The blue that came after the storm had made its argument and withdrawn to let the landscape speak for itself. On the third day after the storm, Alderman Crow came. He came alone in the early afternoon when the temperature had risen enough to make the walk possible, though not comfortable, and he came with the careful deliberateness of a man who had a specific purpose and had spent time preparing for it. Marin heard him on the path, and she watched from the window as he made his way up the slope with the steady, controlled pace of someone who did not intend to let the terrain have the better of them. He knocked with the same authoritative knock she remembered from December. She opened the door. Crow stood on the flat stone step and looked into the cave with the eyes of a man seeing something he had not expected to see. not the existence of two surviving women. He had heard enough by now to know they had survived. What he had not expected, or what his expression told her he had not expected, was the population. Silas Drummond, master builder of Salvation Creek, sitting at the table with Kai Elwyn's journal open before him and a piece of charcoal in his hand, making copies of the diagrams. Silas's wife nursing a cup of something warm. Three children sleeping against the far wall. Owen Drummond sitting up, color restored, eating a portion of bean soup with the focused appreciation of someone who has been recently reminded that eating is a thing worth focusing on. Two other adults from the neighboring families who had come to Coldwater Bluff on the second day of the storm and had stayed because staying was warmer than returning. Crow's gaze moved through all of this and settled on Marin. She had placed the tin box on the table before she opened the door. She did this not as a theatrical gesture, but as a practical one. Everything that needed to be available was available, and the tin box contained what was relevant to whatever Crow had come to discuss. "Miss Elwyn," he said. "Mr. Crow." He stepped inside. He went through the same sequence of observations that everyone went through when they entered the cave for the first time: the walls, the floor, the fire, the air. His hand went to the stone wall without his appearing to decide to put it there. The automatic gesture of the hand reaching for the information that the eyes could not supply. He stood for a moment with his palm against the warm stone. Then he looked at Marin, and she opened the tin box and she placed the deed on the table where he could see it without touching it, and beside it the letter from the county recorder and the copy he had brought in December, and beside that the original document from the council meeting in October with all 5 signatures, including his. She did not say anything. She had learned in 17 years of being on the wrong side of the kind of power that Crow represented that the moment when such power confronted an unexpected outcome was not a moment that required speech from her side. The facts in front of him were sufficient. The deed was legal and clear and recorded in Helena. The land was hers. Free and clear, as Crow himself had said in October in the town hall, with the air of a man bestowing a gift that should inspire gratitude. He had said it expecting her to fail. He had said it expecting the land to revert through her death or departure to a status where it could be managed according to whatever calculation he had been running behind his neutral eyes. That calculation had been wrong, and the wrongness of it was present in every warm square foot of the cave around him, in the face of every person who had survived the worst storm in the territory's memory, because there had been somewhere warm to come. He looked at the deed. He looked at Marin. She met his eyes without performance, no defiance, no satisfaction, no appeal, just the direct regard of someone stating a fact through the act of looking. "This land is mine, Mr. Crow," she said. "Free and clear, as you said." She paused. "I want to make sure we both remember that." The room was quiet. 12 people, and the small clean fire and the warm floor, and the silence that occupies a space when something irrevocable has just been acknowledged. Crow looked at Silas Drummond, who was watching him from the table with the journal and the charcoal sketches spread before him. There was something in Silas's expression that Crow had perhaps never seen there before, or perhaps had seen and had always understood as confirmation of shared positions, and was now reading differently because the positions were no longer shared. It was the expression of a man who had recently made an error of serious consequence and was in the early stages of understanding how to account for it. Crow looked at Owen Drummond eating soup alive. He looked at the children sleeping against the warm wall. He looked at the thin column of vapor barely visible through the window from the chimney stack 40 feet away, and he looked at the heavy black smoke that was undoubtedly still issuing from every rebuilt fire in Salvation Creek, and he did the arithmetic that he was always doing, the arithmetic of advantage and disadvantage and the shifting values of things. The deed was recorded. The land was hers. His calculation in October had assumed an outcome that had not occurred, and there was nothing in the county recorder's filing system or the territorial legal code that allowed a deed to be revisited on the grounds that the person receiving it had turned out not to be disposable after all. He picked up his gloves from where he had set them on the edge of the table. "Good day, Miss Elwyn," he said. He walked out the door and down the slope toward Salvation Creek, his footsteps deliberate and careful on the packed snow, his figure diminishing into the white and blue landscape of the aftermath, and he did not look back. Marin watched him go until he was gone. Then she closed the door and put the deed back in the tin box and set the tin box back in the shelf of rock where it lived, and she went to the table and sat across from Silas and looked at the diagrams he had been copying and said, "The joint between the firebox and the entrance to the flue is the most critical seal in the system. If it's not airtight, you lose the draw and the smoke comes back into the room." Silas picked up the charcoal. "Show me," he said. She showed him. The spring that came to Salvation Creek after the children's blizzard came to a different community than the one that had gone into the winter. It was not a community transformed in the dramatic sense of communities that have survived a disaster and emerged from it with a new mythology of themselves. It was quieter than that and more fundamental. It was a community that had had something demonstrated to it in terms it could not argue with by a force that did not accept argument in conditions that made the difference between right and wrong immediately and physically and absolutely clear. 3 people in the valley had died in the blizzard. None of them had made it to Coldwater Bluff. More would likely have died without the cave. The specific accounting of that counterfactual was impossible to make with precision, but everyone in Salvation Creek understood in the way that communities understand things that have been lived rather than told what the cave had meant and what the cave had been. The rebuilding that spring was different from any previous season of construction. Silas Drummond did not build a single new log cabin. What he built instead on the first project of the new season was a retrofitted version of the Elwyn system for the Mercer family's existing structure, excavating the flue beneath their existing floor, relining the hearth, constructing a new chimney at the required distance. He worked from the diagrams he had copied and recopied from Kay Elwyn's journal, refining them with his own builder's understanding of materials and tolerances, adding the structural details that his 25 years of construction experience supplied. The combination of Marin's principles and Silas's execution produced something that was better than either of them would have built alone, more elegant in its materials, more robust in its construction, more adaptable to the varying conditions of different structures. He came to Coldwater Bluff to show her his modifications before he built them. He came with his sketches in hand, and he showed them to her at the table where he had first sat with charcoal and paper on the 3rd day of the blizzard, and she looked at them with the careful attention she gave to everything, and she asked the questions that needed asking, and she approved the modifications that deserved approval and modified the ones that needed modification, and Silas went back to town and built what they had agreed on. Owen came with him on those visits. Owen had recovered from his fever without lasting consequence, and the recovery had done something to him beyond simply restoring his health. It had clarified something in his orientation toward the world that had perhaps always been there but was now unambiguous. He was a boy who was going to become a certain kind of man, and the kind of man he was going to become was one who measured things carefully and recorded what he measured and understood that knowledge only fulfilled its purpose when it was shared. He began keeping notes. Not the technical notes of his father, which were the notes of a builder concerned with materials and methods. Owen's notes were the notes of someone trying to preserve a complete account. The technical details, yes, but also the circumstances, the sequence of events, the specific choices that had been made, and the reasons behind them. He wrote in a careful, clear hand that already had more in common with Kai Elwyn's precise script than with the irregular penmanship of a 12-year-old who was still learning his letters. The method became known as the Elwyn method. Not immediately, not officially, not because anyone decreed it or voted on it in the town hall. It became known that way because that was what people said when they talked about it, because the name attached itself to the practice in the natural way that names attach to things that need them. And because the practice itself was spreading through the valley in the way that genuinely useful knowledge spreads by demonstration, by the evidence of warm houses in cold winters, by the specific and persuasive testimony of people who had survived on one side of a storm that other structures had failed to survive. By the end of the following winter, there were 11 structures in Salvation Creek incorporating some version of the Elwyn method. Some were pure applications of the principles Marin had learned from her father's journal. Some were Silas Drummond's modified versions. Some were the interpretations of other builders who had learned enough to understand the principles and were adapting them to their own materials and circumstances. They were not all as good as the original. The system rewarded careful application and punished carelessness, but they were all better than what they replaced. Silas built the best ones. He had become the practitioner of the method in the valley the way a physician becomes the practitioner of a treatment, not the discoverer, and under no illusion about the source of what he was applying, but the person whose hands and knowledge gave the discovery its fullest expression in the physical world. He said this without embarrassment when people asked, because accuracy was a value he had not abandoned just because it was now directed against his own previous positions. The method went north, carried by a rancher from the Bitterroot who had spent a week in Salvation Creek the following spring and asked enough questions to understand the fundamentals. It went east to the mining settlements in the Judith Basin, where the combination of underground thermal mass and the existing knowledge of mine construction made the adaptation particularly effective. In the mining settlements, it became known by different names, but the principle was the same principle, and anyone who looked at the diagrams that eventually circulated through the territorial newspapers could trace the lineage back to a leather-bound journal written by a Welsh miner who had spent his professional life underground, learning the language that the earth spoke to those who listened. Marin and Senna never left the bear's throat. They expanded it over the following years, following the natural fissures in the rock, to open two additional rooms, creating a dwelling that was larger and more comfortable than anything the original cave had suggested was possible. They planted a garden on the terrace below the cave, face a terraced kitchen garden that took advantage of the southern exposure of the lower slope and the relative warmth created by the radiant effect of the rock face behind it, which held the heat of the afternoon sun and released it through the evening in a kind of ambient thermal system that Marin understood precisely and had designed deliberately. Senna's cough did not return. It was gone the way things are gone when they were caused by conditions that no longer exist, not healed exactly, not cured, but simply absent, because the environment that had sustained it had been replaced by an environment that did not. She lived in warm, stable air for the rest of her life, and her lungs, freed from the chronic insult of cold and damp and wood smoke, recovered slowly to something close to what they had been before the bad years, and she was a strong and active woman into her later decades. She outlived Crow by 11 years. Marin never married, though this was her choice rather than her circumstance. She became in the particular way that people become what the communities around them need them to be, the person in the valley that people came to when they had problems that required the combination of technical knowledge and clear sight. Not just problems of building and heating. Those were the primary ones, the ones that kept Silas Drummond on a regular visiting schedule for years. But other problems too. Problems that required someone who could look at a situation with the specific quality of attention that she had inherited from her father, the quality of looking at what was actually there rather than what the frameworks of existing knowledge suggested should be there. She did not seek this role. She had not been trying to become anything other than the person who understood thermal mass and conduction better than the people around her. But being that person in that place at that time had consequences that extended further than the technical domain from which they had originated. Owen Drummond grew up to be a civil engineer. He left Salvation Creek in 1893 for a position with the territorial government in Helena and spent the next 40 years applying the principles he had first encountered in a cave on a north-facing slope in Hardin County. He built things that lasted. He built schools and municipal water systems and 3 bridges that were still standing when his son became an engineer and went to look at them as studies in how his father had thought about problems. He never forgot where the thinking had started. In 1923, when he was 48 years old and had long since established himself as someone whose professional opinion was sought by people whose professional opinions were sought by other people, he deposited in the archives of the Montana Historical Society a collection of documents. K. Elwyn's original journal, the notes he had made as a 12-year-old boy in the cave during the blizzard, a complete technical description of the Elwyn method in its developed form, and a written account of the events of October 1887 through January 1888 as he had witnessed them. On the first page of the written account, he had placed without comment or attribution the last line of K. Elwyn's journal. It was still there in the archive on the original paper in Owen Drummond's careful hand, 70 years after the winter it had been written to survive. The tree fights the wind and breaks. The mountain does not fight the cold. It absorbs the sun and remembers its warmth. Be the mountain. Marin Elwyn lived in the bear's throat for the rest of her life. She lived in it long enough to see the territory become a state, and the mining towns become cities, and the log cabin give way to the insulated house, and the insulated house give way to the furnace, and the furnace give way to things she could not have imagined, and did not entirely approve of, but could not argue were wrong. She was an old woman before she stopped working, and she was still giving her opinion about thermal mass and conductive heat transfer to anyone who came to ask it into the decade when she would have been expected to have given up opinions along with the other strenuous activities of active life. She kept her father's journal. It was at the end the most worn object in the cave, not from neglect, but from the opposite of neglect, from use so persistent and thorough that the cover had been replaced twice, and the pages had been rebound once, and still the volume had the look of something that had been consulted often enough to have become overlong use, physically and spiritually inseparable from the hand that held it. On the last page of the original text in Kai Elwyn's precise angular script were the words that had started everything: "The stone is a miser. It takes a long time to fill its pockets. But a miser, once his pockets are full, is reluctant to spend. Be patient. Feed the stone. The stone will keep your faith." The floor of the bear's throat was warm for as long as the fire was fed. The fire was fed every day for 60 years.